My name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just call myself Dana because that's close enough to the truth without being the truth. I'm 29 years old. I live in a mid sized city in Ohio, and 3 years ago I did something that I have never told anyone the full truth about. Not my therapist, not my husband, not the one friend I have left who still speaks to me. I disappeared. On purpose, for 21 days. And what I learned in those 21 days broke something in me that has never fully healed. And honestly, I don't know if I want it to. I need to back up because the disappearance doesn't make sense without the years that came before it. I grew up the middle child of three. My older brother, Peter, was the golden child, the one who got the scholarship, the one whose achievements were pinned to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like fruit. My younger sister, Callie, was the baby, the one who could do no wrong even when she very clearly did wrong, constantly, spectacularly, and always with an excuse ready before the accusation even landed. And I was the middle one, the quiet one, the one who kept the peace, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who drove 2 hours each way every single Sunday to have dinner with my parents, even after I moved out, even after I got married, even after my own life started demanding things of me that I quietly set aside because someone had to be the reliable one. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this because I think I'm a saint. I'm telling you this because it matters for what happened later. It matters because for 26 years I built an identity around being needed, around being the person who showed up, and I never once stopped to ask what would happen if I simply didn't. The thing that finally cracked me open was small, in the way that these things always are. It wasn't a single dramatic betrayal, it was death by 1,000 cuts, and the cut that finally drew blood was almost embarrassingly minor. My father was turning 60. My mother had been planning the party for months, an event at a rented hall with a hired caterer and a slideshow of old photographs, the whole production. I offered to help with the planning from the very beginning. I coordinated with the caterer. I designed the invitations. I spent, by my own accounting, something like 40 hours of my life on a party that wasn't even mine. 2 weeks before the party, my mother called me, and in the middle of a conversation about seating arrangements, she mentioned, almost as an aside, that Callie had suggested moving the party to a Saturday because it worked better with her schedule, and that everyone had agreed it made more sense. Everyone had agreed. I had not been asked. I had in fact already requested time off from work for the original date, a Tuesday, because my father's actual birthday fell on a Tuesday, and I had wanted the party to be as close to the real day as possible. Nobody had thought to check with me before making the change. Not because they were being cruel, that's the part that took me the longest to understand, and the part that still, even now, sits in my chest like a stone. It wasn't cruelty, it was simply that it hadn't occurred to anyone that my schedule mattered enough to check. I said nothing. I rearranged my time off. I showed up to the party on the new Saturday with a slideshow I'd built and a cake I'd ordered and a toast I'd written, and I stood in the corner of that rented hall and watched my sister receive compliments on what a wonderful job she'd done organizing everything, because somewhere along the way, in my mother's retelling to relatives and family friends, the party had become Callie's doing. I didn't correct anyone. I smiled. I ate a piece of the cake I'd ordered and paid for, and I drove home that night in silence. And somewhere on that dark highway between the rented hall and my apartment, something in me went very, very quiet. The quiet lasted for weeks. I want to describe it accurately because I think people who haven't felt it assume it's the same as depression, and it wasn't, not exactly. It was more like a kind of clarity, a cold, clean, terrible clarity. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to notice. How my mother's Christmas card list had my brother's family listed first, then my sister's, then mine, always in that order, every year, like a hierarchy nobody had ever voted on, but everyone somehow understood.
How my father, when introducing me to new acquaintances, would say, "And this is Dana, she's very responsible," in a tone that made responsible sound like a consolation prize for not being interesting. I started an experiment in my head before I ever consciously decided to act on it. The experiment was this: what would happen if I simply stopped? Not forever. I wasn't suicidal, and I want to be very direct about that because I know this is a sensitive thing to even bring up in a story like this, and it's not what this was. I was not in danger of hurting myself. I was in danger of disappearing into my family's furniture, becoming a fixture so reliable that my presence had stopped registering as a choice I was making and started registering as a fact of the household, like the dining table or the porch light. I wanted to know if I mattered as a person or if I mattered as a function. So I planned it. I want to tell you honestly that the planning took nearly 4 months, and every part of it was deliberate. I told my husband, Marcus, the truth, because I could not do this to him, not really, not the way I was about to do it to my family. I told him I needed to take an unannounced trip, alone, to think about some things, and that I would be checking in with him privately every few days so he wouldn't worry, but that I needed him to not tell anyone where I was or that I was safe. He didn't love the idea. He argued with me about it for 2 straight weeks, but he had also watched up close for 6 years of marriage what my family did to me in small increments, and eventually he agreed on the condition that if I didn't check in every 3 days, he would go straight to the police, no exceptions. I rented a small cabin 2 states away under a friend's name, paid in cash where I could. I took a leave of absence from work using vacation days I'd been hoarding for exactly this kind of situation without knowing it. And on a Thursday morning in October, I sent a single text to my family group chat that said, "I need some time to myself. Please don't worry, I'll explain when I'm ready." And then I turned my phone off, drove to the airport, and flew somewhere nobody would think to look. I want to tell you what those 21 days felt like, because they were, in some ways, the most peaceful days of my adult life, and in other ways, they were the loneliest. I read 4 books. I walked for hours through unfamiliar woods. I cooked simply meals for one and ate them slowly, without checking my phone, without waiting for anyone else's needs to interrupt mine. For the first few days, it felt like floating, like I had set down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying until it was gone. But underneath the peace was the real experiment, the one I was too afraid to admit to myself I was running. I had asked Marcus to keep a log. Every call, every text, every mention of me from my family, he was to write it down, word for word if he could, and save it for when I came back. I told myself this was so I could understand what I'd put people through. The truth, which I only admitted to myself much later, was that I wanted evidence. I wanted proof, one way or another, of what my absence was worth to the people who claimed to love me.
The first 3 days, according to Marcus's log, were frantic. My mother called him 11 times. My father drove to our apartment twice. Callie posted something vague and tearful on social media about praying for someone very special to me, which in retrospect I found almost funny because she never once texted me directly, not before I left and not during, despite having my number the whole time. Peter, my older brother, offered to help coordinate a search if it comes to that, which was such a Peter thing to say, so managerial, so detached, that reading it later made me laugh out loud alone in that cabin, and then, immediately after, made me cry. By day 7, the calls to Marcus had slowed to once a day. By day 12, they had slowed to twice a week. By day 15, my mother called Marcus not to ask if there was news, but to ask whether he thought it would be all right if the family went ahead and did Thanksgiving without me this year, just in case, because Callie had already started planning the menu, and it seemed easier to know now rather than later. Marcus, to his credit, told her that was an insane thing to be planning around while I was still missing. My mother's response, which he wrote down verbatim because he knew, even in the moment, that I would need to see it in her own words, was,
Well, we don't know that anything happened to her. She's probably just being dramatic somewhere. Dana's always been sensitive. Being dramatic somewhere. That was the working theory my own mother had settled on 16 days into my unexplained disappearance, before any of them had contacted the police, before any of them had, as far as Marcus could tell, done anything at all beyond a handful of phone calls and one half-hearted drive-by of an apartment I clearly wasn't in. Nobody had contacted the police, not once. Not my mother, not my father, not my brother, the supposed manager of hypothetical search efforts, not my sister, who'd posted a single vague and tearful status update, and then, according to her own account later, figured Dana just needed space. She does that sometimes. Despite the fact that I had never once, in 29 years, done anything remotely like this. I sat with that information for a full day before I could move past it. 21 days is not a short time for an adult woman to go completely silent, especially with no history of instability, no history of vanishing, a stable marriage, a stable job. Any reasonable family, I think, confronted with that kind of silence, would have escalated within the first week. Mine had settled into a story about my dramatics and started planning Thanksgiving. On day 19, Callie texted Marcus, not me, asking if it would be weird for her to borrow my good stand mixer for a cookie exchange, since I obviously wasn't using it right now. That single text did more to clarify 29 years of family dynamics than any conversation we'd ever had. I wasn't a person to her in that moment. I was an inconvenience with a nice kitchen appliance. I came home on day 21. I want to describe the reunion honestly, because it wasn't the tearful, grateful, transformative scene you might expect from a story like this. My mother cried, yes, but the tears came fast and dried fast, and within 20 minutes she was already asking, with real irritation in her voice, why I hadn't just called if I needed a break. Didn't I know how worried everyone had been? My father hugged me stiffly and then asked, not unkindly but not warmly either, if I'd at least gotten some good thinking done, like I'd been on a corporate retreat. Peter sent a single text that said, "Glad you're okay," without a single question about where I'd been or why, and Callie, when she finally saw me in person 4 days later, spent most of the visit talking about the cookie exchange and how well the stand mixer had performed. Nobody asked why. Not really, not in a way that suggested they wanted to actually understand rather than just move past an uncomfortable interruption to normal life. I didn't tell them about Marcus's log for almost a year. I carried it like a loaded weapon I wasn't sure I'd ever use, reading it alone some nights when the old patterns crept back in, when I found myself, almost against my will, offering to plan another family event, driving another 2 hours for another Sunday dinner, saying yes to another small erasure because saying no felt like more effort than it was worth. The reckoning, when it came, wasn't planned like the disappearance had been. It came out during a fight, the way these things often do, ugly and unpolished and much messier than the version I'd rehearsed in my head for months. It was at my father's 61st birthday, a full year after the party that had started it all, and my mother made an offhand comment about how we've all moved past that strange business last year, meaning my disappearance, meaning the 21 days I had spent essentially testing whether my own family would notice I was gone, and something in me finally broke open. I told them everything about the log, about the 11 calls in 3 days that dwindled to nothing by day 15, about Thanksgiving planning discussed before I was found, about the stand mixer. I read them Marcus's notes, word for word, in a voice that I'm told stayed eerily calm the entire time, though inside I felt like I was coming apart at every seam. My mother's face went white and then red. She said I had twisted things, that of course she'd been worried, that grief looks different for different people, that she couldn't be expected to fall apart publicly just because she was scared privately. Maybe there's truth in that. I've turned that possibility over many times since. Grief is not a uniform performance, and maybe my mother's fear lived somewhere I couldn't see, somewhere that never made it into a phone call to my husband. I try some days to hold space for that possibility, because the alternative, that I simply wasn't worth the visible fear, is a harder thing to carry. Callie cried, genuinely cried, and told me she was sorry, that she hadn't understood how bad things were, that she genuinely believed I was fine somewhere and would come back when she was ready, because that's what she would have wanted for herself. I believe that she believed that. I think that might be the saddest part of this whole story, that my sister's failure to look for me wasn't malice, it was simply an inability to imagine that my needs might be different from her own, an inability that had never once been challenged because I had spent my whole life making sure it never needed to be. Peter didn't apologize. Peter said, and I remember this exactly because it was so perfectly, infuriatingly him, "I don't see what you wanted us to do differently. You told us not to worry. We didn't worry. Seems like it worked." I haven't spoken to Peter since that night, not really, not beyond the bare minimum required at family gatherings I still, God help me, sometimes attend. My relationship with my mother is thinner now, more careful, the kind of relationship where we both know something true was said out loud that can't be fully unsaid, even though neither of us mentions it anymore. Callie and I have actually grown closer, oddly enough, in the years since, because she was the only one who seemed to genuinely sit with what she'd done rather than defend it. I don't know if I'd do it again. I think about that question more than any other when I turn this whole story over in my mind, late at night, like you press on a bruise to check if it still hurts. 21 days of silence taught me something true about my place in my family that 29 years of showing up never could have taught me, because showing up never gave anyone the chance to reveal what they'd do if I didn't. But the knowledge came at a cost I'm still paying. I know things now I can't unknow. I know exactly how long it takes my mother to worry out loud, and exactly how short a list I make it onto when convenience is weighed against affection. Some nights I think that knowledge was worth having, because at least now I'm not performing a closeness that was never fully real. At least now I know exactly where I actually stand instead of where I assumed I stood. Other nights, I think I destroyed something that might have survived longer, might have papered over its cracks for another decade if I'd just never gone looking for the truth of it. I don't have a tidy answer. I don't think there is one. What I do have is Marcus's log, still saved, still readable, a strange and terrible document that proved something I'd spent my whole life too afraid to test. I don't reread it often anymore, but I know exactly where it is, and some part of me, the part that used to drive 2 hours every Sunday without ever once being asked if that worked for me, needs to know it's still there.